Hey everyone, it's Casey here, just setting up my screen, getting ready. Oh, no, haven't started. Well, starting right now. Starting right now, so hopefully you can hear me now. Apologies, a couple minutes late, just setting up my screen, a few other cool things in the background. So, hopefully you can hear me. Can anyone, just someone put in the chat if they can definitely hear me, because someone said they couldn't. Hopefully you can hear. Yes, awesome. Thank you. Excellent. Let me just get my good stuff. Good stuff. Okay, let me get my screen sorted and we'll get going. So this is all recorded too. So if you have to drop off, if you're I know some people are saying they're having trouble getting in. So we had three 300 people, over 300 people sign up. So there's a few people coming and going, so that's cool. So tonight we'll be going over Claude for Clinicians. So I'm Casey, I'm a GP, practice owner, founder of MBS Pro, which is like an AI suite of tools for GPs. In the context of, building those businesses and companies, I've been using Claude and AI, but Claude extensively, and really Claude for clinicians just sounds better than AI for clinicians or something like that. So, sort of good alliteration. So that's sort of what I've said it as. But we'll be talking about a few other AI products as well. This presentation is for GPs, doctors, interns, residents, practice managers, practice nurses, receptionists, anyone that essentially works in a clinical space. But we won't be talking about clinical use of AI. We're going to be talking about non-clinical things. So things that you do in your practice, in your work admin, life admin, things like that. The reason why I've kept it away from clinical things, there's probably a few key things. It's really difficult to use the main foundational large language models in the context of clinical data. So all the scribing softwares, of which we are one, all have their own sort of enterprise agreements with, Microsoft and OpenAI and Anthropic, etc., which essentially means that all of our data is cordoned off. So, for example, with MBS Pro, it's a scribe where you talk to your patient and summarizes the consult run. All that data does not go into the same place that data goes into when you use like ChatGPT and you say, hey, where can I get cheap tickets to Barcelona or something like that. So they're completely cordoned off. What that means is that when you ask for cheap tickets to Barcelona, Anthropic and OpenAI probably train the AI on that data. And that's probably not a big deal because, finding tickets to Barcelona, who cares, right? But if you're saying, my patient has a headache and, I think this could be a differential and what do you reckon? And, this is their home address or something like that, that's a problem. So I've purposefully kept it away from clinical things. So any sort of clinical questions ideally should be using like a clinical grade scribe. So there's a whole heap of them. We're one of them. They're all really great. Like the main ones, the big ones are all awesome. And there are lots of, really useful things that you can do with them. I would say keep your clinical stuff there. Keep your non-clinical stuff, wherever you feel comfortable to keep it. Bearing in mind that some of the things that we'll talk about, so looking at like your BAS statement, your P&Ls, your finances, you may not want that to go into a, OpenAI and Anthropic's databases and let your AI learn off your, finances. That could happen. That is in the privacy statements, terms and conditions, etc., of those big things. I'm not saying they do that. Everything is pretty secure, but I can't guarantee anything, of course. So these are things that you should use, with caution, which is why I say, absolutely don't use clinical stuff within main AI scribe, not main AI scribes, main foundational LLMs, but it can do a whole heap of other stuff, which is really useful and really useful. So let me bring up this PowerPoint and we'll get going. Let me bring this up. 1 second, 1 second. And so this is all recorded. It'll go up on my YouTube channel. I have a whole heap of stuff on there. If you have any questions, which I don't know if no one's asked any questions yet. No, that's cool. Ask some questions. We'll go through it. This is a learning space, so there's a ton of stuff that I'm learning from too, and hopefully we can go over some things that are helpful for you as well. In my YouTube videos, I do go through more of a how-to, so like how to do this, how to set this up, that sort of thing. And that is a bit longer, like the videos are like an hour long. This is an hour presentation. I'm going to talk about a few other things and gloss over some things. And I think it will be useful if I split this up, and I might even do some extra things for like power users and things like that. So let me share my screen and we'll get into it. Any issues, let me know, ask some questions, and we'll crack on. Excellent. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can all see my screen now. Claude for Clinicians. Let me know if you can't see my screen, and I will move this here 1 second. Come on. I'm gonna make the big boom. If there's any questions, I'll do questions after a couple of slides. Now I can definitely see the irony of using PowerPoint and sort of describing an AI thing, right? So what I've tried to do is take pictures. So you can have a look at these slides later. They've got a lot of pictures in them, which will make sense in terms of like doing it yourself. The YouTube videos also walk you through things as well. So that's my YouTube channel at Dr. Casey Going. I have a few cool things on there. And chat should be turned on. Can everyone tell me the chat is there, correct? I've got a chat. Yep, there's people in there, and there's Q&A, which should be turned on as well. So feel free to ask questions in there. Excellent. So we're going to be talking about a few different things in terms of AI, what it can do in terms of the non-clinical context. I've tried to rank this into like beginning, intermediate, advanced. There's a few really cool workflows which are, easy to do, super low risk, cool. And then there are maybe higher risk things, but higher risk, higher reward, I'd probably say. There's a ton of AI around. It's not going away. There's a huge amount of GPs that are using it in the context of AI scribing. And I think a lot of hospitals are starting to get into it as well. So this is a conversation about how can we use it in our like life admin, business context, where it's sort of lower risk, and probably not going to affect sort of patients and things like that as such. So we're going to talk about how we're going to set up Claude, how we can set up the folders, connectors, the context, how we can work in projects, scheduling tasks, reconciliation. Reconciliation is in the context of like bank statements, matching records, and things like that. That is maybe a high risk thing, right? Like you're putting in data into LLM, so just be aware of that. Building spreadsheets, I've just used an example like a GP aged care incentive payment tracker. So the GP aged care incentive is an incentive for doctors that go and see aged care residents. You have to do a certain amount of billings at a certain amount of time, and it's something that definitely should be tracked in a spreadsheet. So we'll talk about how we can build one of those. Meetings and newsletters. So this is like a really cool workflow whereby you might use something like Otter AI, Fireflies AI, a whole heap of other sort of things that record your non-clinical meetings. And then they'll create minutes, action items, clinical updates, and things like that, right? Like that's pretty, we've seen all that. Zoom can do it, etc. And then what you can do is from those summaries, you can get your AI to pull out all the action items and then turn it into like a newsletter. And you can automate that whole workflow. So it might be an internal clinical newsletter about, what's happening at your clinic this week, what's been discussed, etc. And that's a really cool workflow. Rosters, contracts. I do a lot of contract work within Claude. Another thing I'd definitely say is AI is awesome at a lot of things. It has a lot of domain knowledge in separate things. Let me get rid of that there. It has a lot of, oh my goodness, all these note takers around. Has a lot of domain knowledge, but it is not a lawyer. So just be aware of that. You can get Claude to draft you a contract, but it's not a lawyer. It'll make mistakes. It pulls, contract law from like America or Europe, which may not be relevant to us, so on and so forth. So just be aware of that. Artifacts. So artifacts is a really cool feature within Claude. Essentially what it does is it'll pull from a lot of your connectors, which we'll talk about. Connectors are things that give Claude context. So when we think about AI, AI is trained on a ton of data by OpenAI, Anthropic. So they give it the internet and say, these things are true, these things are not true, and it trains it. So it's got some intelligence. When you set up your folders and connectors, you're giving it your context. So your bank statements, your Xero, your Stripe, your meetings, etc. Any of your, I don't know, policies and procedures for your accreditation, which is, a useful way of using Claude as well. And when it's got your context, it can answer your questions much easier. When you give it your context and you set up something like an artifact is something that will it's a live database that will pull in data from your email, your Outlook, etc., and create like a like a calendar for you, a live calendar from all of its connectors, a live dashboard on, I don't know, like cash flow or something like that if you're connecting Xero and Stripe, all sorts of things. But it does it live as opposed to always chatting, prompting into a chat, how many emails have I got unread today? And you say that every single day into the chat. It just displays it live because you've told it to pull into all of those things. So, and I'm going to do a little taste of the BAS. Now, I know that's a really interesting thing. Now, the reason why I've said a taste of it because I'm actually going to get an accountant on, and we'll talk about it more and how we can, workflow it. So I'll just do like a teeny tiny bit of it. I've only got an hour. I don't want to keep you too long, but just hopefully that'll be useful. So things that I use it for. So I'm a practice owner. P&L statements, looking at billings. Looking at any sort of trends analysis, things like that. Really good for contract. So I will give it a base contract, and then I'll say, can you modify it for these particular things, for these, GPs, allied health, receptionists, nurses, etc. Really, really fast at doing that. So if you've got a base contract that you've had developed by a lawyer, I think that's like excellent. So that's what we have. We've got a base contract, and then we can modify it really easily to all of those, separate, groups super quickly. So that's like super awesome. Contractors and GPs, so things that I use it for as a with my GP hat on, inbox admin type tasks. So it pulls in all my inboxes and calendars. You can do things like reconciliations. I have a whole heap of bank statements where I have no idea where payments have come from. It'll pull from my calendar, my email, all my emails, and then it'll say this is probably what that payment was because payment date. This is where I was on that date. I was away for the weekend or I was over overseas or something like that. This is probably what the payment is. So that's like a really useful way of doing it. I use that a lot. And we'll talk about a fully automated workflow about that. For practice managers, again, reconciliation, VAS prep, rostering help. That's a really useful one. So in my clinic, we've got 17 consult rooms, and we've got like 30 plus doctors. So when you're trying to figure out, who's going to go in what room and, they want to go in 2 days a week or a half day here, that's a really complex thing to keep track of. So you can create a spreadsheet, that's easy, right? And then you can get Claude to manipulate it and ensure that, everything makes sense and, checks itself. Accreditation, that's a really useful one. So you've probably done accreditation at your clinic. So this is GP accreditation, but you can use it anywhere, I guess. And essentially what you do is you grab all your old documentation and then you might grab the RSCGP 5th standards because maybe your accreditation was previously done on the 4th standard. So you grab your documentation, put it in a folder and then say, can you look at the new standards and apply it to these old documentations, which are under the 4th standards, update it, so on and so forth. So again, the more context that you can give your AI, the better it's going to give you answers. So if you just say, create some documentation, it will create it, but it's probably not that relevant to your practice. Your practice in Sydney is going to be different to a practice in, Western Queensland or, Darwin or something like that. So just being aware of that. Now, in terms of AI safety rules, again, I'm really trying to focus on non-clinical things so that, we don't have any of these sort of issues, which is, putting in names, date of birth, things like that, because we're not doing that data. We're putting in, your own, email roster or something like that. In terms of connecting it up to, say, emails that might get clinical data, so your internal clinical emails, that's a tricky one, and I probably wouldn't do that. So I have an email for my clinic. I have not connected it to Claude. It's a real pain because I think, oh, gee, I could be so much more efficient. But just being aware of that, there are things that maybe occur in your emails that are sensitive. That if Claude had access to it or any other AI, like I'm using Claude as a example, theoretically, then it would be an AI LLM that is not beholden to sort of the rules that the AI scribes adhere to. So just being aware of that. So a little bit about AI. So there's a couple of foundational models. So the foundational models are essentially what every other AI tool runs on. There are not hundreds of different types of AIs generally. There are 4 main types. So Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, and Grok. There are also other models which are called open models. So essentially they are models that are created by people, developers, and they are really cool. Probably not as good as these other ones. Are they safe? They're probably safe. They're probably, but your mileage may vary. So I'm only talking about like the foundational ones, which are those 4, which I don't have Grok on here. And then there are tons of other AI tools. Almost all the all of the main AI tools, all of the main ones, not all of them, all of the main AI tools probably run on the foundational models. So Fireflies, which is meeting transcription, Otter, which is meeting transcription, things like Perplexity, Notebook, LLM, they almost always run on something like Claude, OpenAI, Gemini as a foundational model, just to be just to be aware of that. Now I'm going to be talking about Claude for the most part, but ChatGPT is great as well. Gemini is useful, and I've got a few slides on those things as well. There are two main modes within Claude. There's the general chat, which you've probably all seen. So chat GPT or chat within Claude or chat within Gemini, which is where you just ask it a question, what is the weather like today? Question answer type style. That is useful, and I use that a lot. Where I use it mostly is probably in Gemini. So I've got Gemini on my phone, and I'll say, hey Gemini, can you look at my email and find this particular email? And it finds it for me, and that's useful. Whereas cowork, so Claude cowork, and I'll show this to you in 1 second. Claude cowork is more of an agentic tool. So you probably heard of that term, agentic. So agentic just means that you can get it to do things, and you don't necessarily need to be, chatting to it or following it up. You can just say, can you do this? Now, with these tasks, there's a couple of things to be aware of. So one, they use up a lot of tokens. So tokens is kind of like fuel for AI. So it uses a lot of fuel because it's like thinking really hard, especially for heavy multi-step work where it's running up multiple agents to do multiple things. The other thing to be aware of is it can take a little while of time. Like it can literally take 20 minutes of thinking like it's or looking like it's thinking, and you might be sitting there going, oh wow, when I ask things in chat, it happens pretty much straight away. But it's because it's hopefully creating something of value. So I use Cowork almost exclusively because I'll get it to do my documentation, accreditation, pulling things from emails, calendars, BAS reconciliation, big projects, things like that. Incredibly useful. So use a ton with MBS Pro, my AI Scribe. So very, very useful. It does multi-step work. So one of the things that I look at is in terms of how familiar you are with AI is probably pretty much consistent with how good your prompts are. So what I mean by that is if your prompt is, what is the weather like overseas? It's a really basic prompt. But if your prompt is, can you look at my email, pull all the financial reports from, your accountant, put it into a P&L, and then email that to my bookkeeper. That's a multi-step workflow, and Cowork can definitely do that. And that's what I use it for in terms of meeting transcription. So I say, can you pull the meeting that we do? I do meetings with MBS Pro or meetings at the clinic or whatever. Can you pull the meeting? Can you summarize it? Can you turn it into a newsletter? Email that to the, your receptionist who prints the newsletter and gives it to everyone, or better yet, can you just email it to everyone in the clinic? And it'll just send an email from your Gmail or your Outlook or something like that. And that's a useful workflow. And you can schedule that task. So it happens every week. You don't need to be involved. It'll take your meeting records, which would probably happen automatic. So all of these note takers that are joining in here, right? They'll summarize it. You can get it to create like a format or a newsletter format and then email it off to all the people that are interested. So how do we get started? There are sort of five main things, and I'll show you some pictures in a second. When you open, so you can go to the website, claude.com. No, I think it's claude.ai actually. Go to the Claude website. You can download it. So it is an app that sits on your computer as opposed to chat in the browser. When you download it as a desktop application, it can do a few more things. So it can look at your folders. So if you've got a huge amount of folders and they're super messy, like your desktop's covered in things, you can get Claude, open a folder, as in your desktop or wherever all your documents are, and you can say, can you sort this out? And it'll sort it into folders based on the content of everything that's in the folder. And that's a useful feature. The other thing you can do is do connectors. So my main connectors, which I'll show you in a second, Gmail, Outlook, Calendar for both of those. Xero, which is really useful. My like CRM slash meeting tool, which is Adio, but Fireflies, Otter, there's a ton of them. There's like 100 different types. But when you connect it to Claude, it means that you can work within Claude and pull in things like that. Other thing that's useful is Claude in Chrome. So essentially it's Claude as a browser and it works in your browser, so you can get it to do things on your computer. So just on a side note about security, when it's working in your browser, it can literally do anything that someone on your browser could do. So just be aware that you might ask it to I've got a picture in this later on slides where I've said summarize a Wikipedia page, right? Like I don't know if anyone would ever do that, but you can do that. And that's like a really low risk, safe thing to do, right? But if you're opening up Claude inside your bank account, and it's got access to your, it has access to your browser and, theoretically could see like passwords and things like that. So just be aware of how that the way that you're using it. It'll depend on your comfort level. So if you're super comfortable, that's awesome. If you're not so much, just be aware of, Claude and Chrome. Claude also has its own security like notifications. Like it says, just be aware of using Claude in Chrome. It's one thing to have a hallucination on your newsletter out to your clinic where it misspells someone's name or says something funny and we all have a laugh about it. It's another thing when it's on your browser and it can access, Facebook accounts and emails and all sorts of things in an unsecured manner. So all of the connectors in this point too, they're like secure and they'll ask you, as in Claude will ask you, can I do this? Can I do this? When it's on Chrome, it will also ask you, but because it can do things agentically without you watching it, it can do some pretty nifty things. You may not be aware of it because you're not watching it. You've gone and done another thing. And so just be aware of that. Scheduled tasks, we talked about that a little bit, and I'll talk about a bit more, and then skills. So I'm going to talk about skills probably in another session or on a YouTube video. So I haven't talked about that much or at all, really. Essentially, skills are if you're doing repeatable tasks, you can get Claude to work in a way that is more in line with your brand or your voice or the way that you write, and it bundles that into a skill as a repeatable task. So every time it does that thing, so for example, write a newsletter, it writes it in the way that you like because you've got a skill that resembles your voice. So voice being like the way that you write. So putting all those things together, it's a really, really useful tool. I'm not going to talk about skills. I'm going to talk about the other things. So this is like a basic thing, I suppose, and hopefully helpful. So let's go on to the next one. So I've done this in three sort of levels. So basic, intermediate, advanced. I know I've talked about a few of those things already in that context. So let's go on the next one. So basic drafting and emailing replies, like I said, we've all used AI to do that, right? Like, write a reply, polish this reply, that's awesome. That's useful. Summarize threads, adjust tone, that's pretty basic. Meeting prep, so, build an agenda from this meeting, you've taken some notes, you give it to your AI. That's cool, and, super useful. So when I talk about basic, intermediate, advanced, I'm not sort of saying that in the context of, like making fun of anyone. What I'm saying is that you all start out at basic. Like this is exactly what I did, and then you get more familiar with the tools, and then you start pushing it and say, well, what else can I do with that tool? What else is useful? What else can I get to do that's going to provide more value going on? So, I've got a meeting, I get my minutes, I've got my action items, and then the next step might be, can you email the action items to each person? That's awesome, right? And then the next step after that might be, can you check up with those people on those action items in a week? So send another email and say, hey, how have you gone with that action item? And then that way you can get, more value from it without necessarily having to have a lot of your own cognitive load on these things. Drafting, letters, summarizing PDFs, copy and pasting in things like patient notices. So, you've got a new flu clinic, putting social media out on your social media accounts or a newsletter or something like that. This is a really awesome way of doing it. We've got practice managers at our practices that are doing that, and that saves a good amount of time. Like that's awesome. ChatGPT can do that. Claude can do that. Grok, Gemini, anything can do that. So in terms of getting used to things, probably picking a tool, having a play around with it, like literally just talking to, ChatGPT or Claude and saying, what are the things you can help me with? I think that's a really useful way of getting started as a basic way. Just remember to keep, your clinical data or any data that you just don't want to be, in AI, not an AI, don't put in identifiers, things like that, right? That normal sort of stuff. Taking your messy notes, dot points, using context from meetings to draft email replies is even a quicker way. So instead of you writing an email and saying, can you polish this? You can say, write an email based on the last meeting that we had in the context of this recent email that I had, and it pulls from all those connectors and does it a bit better. And then prompting. Let me talk about prompting in 1 second. What I'm going to do now is I just want to share with you the setup of Claude. So I've got it on another PowerPoint here, and let me answer some questions while I bring this one up here. Excellent. And we'll go through some questions before we talk about the prompting, because I want to make sure that everyone's happy with setting it up. So a couple little questions. So what model of Claude do you generally recommend? There's so much in here. We have more resources, so a ton of resources to share, like a ton of resources. So I've been using Fable. That's the new model of Claude. That Fable is like super awesome, and it runs through your credits like so incredibly quick. which is probably like I read yesterday that to draft an email reply is like the same amount of energy that is used to like water a plant for like a week or something like that. Something, oh gosh, like all those email replies. So let me show you the setup of it here. So in Claude, and I've got a YouTube video that'll walk you through this. So in Claude, when you go to your settings, you've got a few different things that you can see up the side here. So we've got our connectors, which are really important. We'll talk about that. And we've got our capabilities. So in capabilities, you've got your memory. So what that means is that all your chats essentially reference each other. That's really useful because you might write into a chat, what was that thing I talked about the other day, and we created like a spreadsheet and a PowerPoint presentation. Can you take whatever that was and add it to this new information that I've got? So for example, I was looking at like buying a property, right? It's a commercial property. I had some basic information about it, and I sort of looked at it like 2 weeks ago and sort of left it. And then today I got some more information about it, like some much more specific information. Could not find that other chat. You can search for it, couldn't find it. Um, but I don't need to find it because what I can do is I can just tell Claude, like, here's this new information. Can you reference that other chat where I looked at like the cost of this commercial property, combine this information, and give me like an estimated cost, like build a model of how much you think this was cost based on the outgoings that I've got information for now. So that's a really useful thing. So I like to keep all the data together. I know people might recommend, sort of siphoning and siloing data. I totally get that. But the more context that you can build, the better it is. So here's an advanced sort of pro tip. When you're talking about context, Claude cowork can grab context from your folders. There are software tools like Obsidian or Notion that you can connect, where you can keep a database of everything about you, which is a scary thought, right? Everything about me, but everything about your projects, and then Claude can just grab relevant information depending on the context of your question from those databases. And that's a really useful way of getting highly contextual answers to the questions that you have. So let's talk about Claude in Chrome. So I've also got that. You have to enable that. Just be aware that, there's a security thing. Be aware of that. That's why it says in beta. So the reason why you have to specifically enable that in Claude and Chrome is because, there is a little bit of risk involved with that. So this is what Claude and Chrome looks like. It is a bit funny. It opens up another tab. You can give it a prompt. So I said, can you summarize this page? It's just a Claude page. And then it'll give you a plan. So this is the planning stage of AI is really useful in the context of AI is a bit of a black box. We have no idea what happens. We tell it to do something, it like thinks and does stuff, and we have no idea what it's doing, and then it just produces an output. So when it's planning, you can get an idea of where it's going. So the plan is, I'm going to read this page, and then I'm going to summarize it. You like that's super basic, right? But you might get it to do sort of other things. So you might get it to take a whole heap of pictures of, some PDFs or some, P&Ls from, say, competitors, right? That are published online, and then you're going to build a P&L in your own spreadsheet and put it all together. So Claude can do that where you may not have a connector, like an API. It can pull that together based on just a web page. Really, really useful. So I use Claude in Chrome quite a bit, and it's a very useful tool. So this is the summary, summarize it, whatever, but you can get it to do a whole heap of things. So what have I got it to do? I will get it to take like screenshots of things and build models on those screenshots. I'll get it to, reference like, useful social media, like pictures and things like that, and build out like our social media flywheel as it is. So how can we produce a lot of social media content like really easily? So it's really, really useful. Just be aware of those other things. Now, connectors. These are the connectors that I have. This is across both like my personal life, I guess, and like MBS Pro being the AI sort of stuff that we do. Atlassian, Adio, Expedia, Gmail, Google Calendar, Google Drive, Intercom, Lovable, Microsoft, and Zero. I think those are pretty good ones. Other really good ones. I don't use Slack. Slack, I think, is really, really good. We don't use it. Slack is like Microsoft Teams. It's like a chat. So the things that you can do, which are really cool, Slack, is that you can get Claude to run a scheduled task where it might pull, for example, your meetings, and then it will send it to the appropriate people, like the action points in Slack. So remember, we talked about that before. It can do that all through Slack, which is like really useful. Notion is like a database. The other one is Obsidian. So you can have a whole heap of content in Notion. So for example, you might have the action points of your previous meetings, or you might have all of your accreditation data, documents, etc. Then Claude can connect to it, pull all that information as needed, and build out new things, which is really, really useful. there are tons of connectors and they're getting new ones all the time. So this is like Firefly, so this is just a meeting transcript software. I don't use it. I've heard good things, like, I'm sure it's pretty good. Stripe, Zero, useful things as well. Zero is probably the one that I use the most. So I use it a lot with like our data, financial data, for like MBS Pro, and sort of like how can we, improve that. So it's really useful, as well. Now, the other thing to be aware about cowork is that it'll work inside a folder in your computer. So it sits on your desktop and it works inside a folder. You can see here that I've clicked on cowork. So this is in the settings again, and then these are where all my cowork files and artifacts live in. So, and scheduled tasks. So it's just like a random file. That's probably the wrong one even, but pick a file that you want to pick a folder that you want it to use. So, probably like, your name, computer, Claude file folder or something like that. And then what you can do is you can also set up, a trusted cowork folder. So what that means is that cowork I think is like really safe in that it will always ask you before it does something. It is meant to do that, and it can get a little bit annoying. So if you're happy, you can turn it off for like one folder. So that one folder, which is called, Claude Cowork, you can turn it off. So if it's doing any work inside there, it won't ask you. It'll just do the things that it needs to do. But if it wanders anywhere else, it'll need to ask you. So that's what that is all about. But essentially, you set up a file, that it can connect to, and then you set up a project. So this is more on the main screen now. I know it's sort of blurry because I've got this create project, but essentially what you've got is you've got all your information down the left-hand side. So like all your chats. And then what we're doing now is we're creating a project because we want to do some work and get some things done. So this is my RSCGP accreditation. I've got accreditation coming up at one of my clinics. I want, Claude to create some new accreditation documents in line with the 6th edition. I then, started this, and Claude goes, the 6th edition isn't out. And I go, oh, okay. It's actually the 5th edition, my bad. So we've got a PDF of the 5th edition. We've got that sitting in our folder, so you can add a folder. And then I said, use that 5th edition plus my previous, accreditation documentation, and create some new accreditation documentation based on that. And then the more context that you can give it, the better. So you might give context on your website. You can say, here is my website. Here are all our policies and procedures that are linked on your website. Use that as context to update them so that they are meeting the 5th edition, not the 6th edition. I said 5th. It's meant to be not 6th. It's meant to be 5th. Now, when you create a project, it'll ask you what folder it wants to work in. So you can see every little folder. It's called Claude. You could use that. You can use whatever you want, and that's useful. Probably a more, intermediate advanced tip is that because it is a desktop app, it is only going to work on one computer, right? And all the information that it produces, it will put as an output, as a Word document, spreadsheet, PowerPoint, whatever, in that folder. If you work across multiple devices, what you can do is you can add it to like a OneDrive file. So you can see I've got a OneDrive file. What that means is that I can access the information that it outputs, anywhere. I can access it on my phone, on my other computer, so on and so forth. So that makes it easier to use it across. And then, the next pro tip is that if you have, say, a shared OneDrive folder between your, employees at your clinic or your hospital or something like that, although definitely ask your hospital before you connect Claude to anything, 100%. But if you have a shared folder, so we have one for MBS Pro, people can then create stuff. It goes into that folder and anyone can access it and use it as context for other things. So that is a really useful feature, and way. So I've said, can you create these standards? And then what it does is it looks at the PDF, which I've attached. It'll go, I'll start by exploring the folder, looking at that PDF. It examines it, has a think about it, and this can be thinking for quite a while. So I actually did this like an hour ago, and it was thinking for like half an hour. Yeah, at least half an hour, 20 minutes, something like that. So it can think for a while. So don't watch it while it's thinking. What I do is I'll get a whole heap of parallel tasks. So to give you an example of what I did today, with this is, I did this presentation. I had another presentation I had to do for my registrars. I had several meetings. So all of these meetings, I get Claude to give me pre-meeting data. So I put it into my calendar. I've got a meeting with, this person. Usually there's sort of like an agenda, like I'm having this meeting for a specific reason. It'll give me the agenda, who the people I'm having a meeting with, a bit of background, so I can jump in the meeting and go, oh yes, we're doing this thing for you, and based on this, and get straight into it. Now it'll ask you questions when you want it to do things. So I said create these, documentation. I said, well, what exactly do you want me to do? Do you want me to create a master manual and placeholders? Do you want me to create separate manuals for like different practices? Do you want what do you want to do? Or is it something completely different that I haven't put in there? And then essentially what it'll do is it'll think based on your answers and then create that documentation. Here we go. I should have put this one first. So this is what Claude looks like, and you've got your projects on the top left-hand side, your artifacts, which I'll go through in a little bit, schedule task dispatch. Dispatch is when you can access Claude Cowork on your phone. I don't use it a whole lot. It is useful, but I don't use it a whole lot. I just take my laptop everywhere. And then customize, which is where we added in all the connectors and things like that. Now, creating a scheduled task. This is a really easy and useful way of doing something that you do every week, but without having to think about it. So, for example, I have a scheduled task that looks at my meetings that I've got coming up for the week and just gives me a prompt, gives me a brief, right? So I don't need to tell Claude to do that every week for me because it just can do that every week and I don't need to tell it. So the scheduled task is, say on a Sunday night, have a look through my calendar, look for the meetings that I'm having this week, or even just the next day, depending on what you want to do. Give me a brief of what's going on, any particular key points I need to talk about, blah, blah, blah. The other one that I use scheduled tasks is for like bug reports in our, AI software. So I run a scheduled task. It will pull all the emails that we get, all of the messaging things through our messaging app, which is like Intercom, and it'll pull all of that in one place and say these are the issues that people are having. We can then feed that off to the developers if they can look at those bugs, and like that's a way that we can iterate super super quickly, and that can be all automated. So you could grab from your emails, grab from your like Intercom. You could then put it into your like Jira tickets, which is like a developer thing, and that can be super automated. And then on the developer end, I'm talking about cowork, but the developers use Claude Code, right? And they can grab those tickets. So Claude Code, you can grab it, grab the tickets, look at what the issue is, find the exact problem, the bug in the software, and sort of fix it, pretty much autonomously. So it's really fantastic how these tools can all talk to each other. So in terms of the scheduled tasks, you just essentially give it a name, you give it a description and a prompt, like what exactly is it doing? This is an example, check my Google Calendar for today's meeting, summarize unread meetings, highlight on urgent things. You can get it to work in a project. So if there's a specific context that you want it to need, to do the specific task, you give it some context in a file or a folder to work in, and then you can get it manual mode or automatic. So what manual means is that it'll ask a lot of questions. Automatic means it'll try and figure out a lot on its own. So it depends on how complex your task is. So something like checking your meetings or emails, something, it's not something that I need to be prompted on. I'm happy for it to do it. And then you'll do your model. So we talked about the different models. So there's Fable 5, which is like the top tier model, chews through a ton of credits or tokens, really intelligent, thinks a lot, fantastic, like so good. Then you've got Opus, which is really, really good. And then you've got Haiku, Sonnet, then you've got Haiku. So Sonnet is like a mid-level thing, Haiku is a low-level thing. So the names don't worry about the names. Just think about something like, advanced, high, medium, low in terms of like thinking levels. So the higher the thinking level, the more tokens it's going to use. So it means you burn through your credits, which means it might say, hey, I haven't got any more credits. I've got to wait for like a cooldown period, which is kind of a pain. So if you're just replying to emails, you probably don't need like a super intelligent model. You can just use something that's a little bit less intelligent. It'll probably do it quicker. It'll do just as good a job, and it won't use your token so much. So that's like a useful thing. So here are some other things that you might use for scheduled tasks. Look through your inbox, do a daily briefing, content ideas. So, we post on social media a lot. So, create new content ideas based on context of, this folder with all our previous social media posts. We can even connect it into things like YouTube, and there are some connectors into like your Facebook page and things like that. Not in the context of like talking to people, right? In the context of looking at posts that you've done and measuring the metrics. So how many people have, clicked on it, liked it, etc. So what you do is you connect Facebook through Zapier, which is another connector that's maybe a more advanced thing. You say, look at the metrics, look at the posts that have done the best, repeat those posts in like a similar format. So use that formatting and repeat it. And that's a way that you can really increase the value that you're giving really autonomously, because you're using metrics to sort of drive that as well. So here's my weekly bug reporting. Essentially what I do, essentially what I do is I put in my prompt, look at my emails, find any bugs, create a spreadsheet, send it to the developers. And I do that every week. And that's cool. So I don't really need to be involved with that much at all. So it works really well. This is another example. of something that I think is quite useful as a clinician. And this is reconciliation. So reconciliation being you've used your card for a whole heap of expenses. Some of them are probably business, some of them may not be. I have a business card. I still sometimes do non-business things on it. So I've got to reconcile it. That's a me problem. And not so great, whatever. But I can fix it with this. So essentially what I'll do is I'll copy and paste in my unreconciled things that my accountant sends me when he's like, WTF, what is all this? And I go, oh yeah. So I can paste it in. It'll look through my calendar, my emails, my Gmails, my Outlook calendars, like everything, my whole life, and then say, oh yeah, these costs are probably these things. When you buy something and it comes up on your statement as like some random thing, and you like have no idea, no recollection of what exactly you did. Claude can figure it out, which is great. Now, an even better workflow, so next level up for a sort of more advanced workflow, is if you get your accountant to send an email to you and say, can you reconcile this? You run a scheduled task in Claude, which then picks up that email, reconciles it, replies, and so you don't need to do anything. That's a really awesome end-to-end workflow that I think works really well. This is my Attio. So Attio is kind of like Fireflies or Otter, so they're meeting recording software AI. Essentially, I forgot what had happened at one meeting. There was a few things that I needed to follow up on. So I just said, Claude, can you review that meeting and just figure out what are those things that I needed to follow up on? I know that there was a couple of like adjustments and blah, blah, blah. And then it says, okay, yeah, I'll have a look at that. I'll have a look at that meeting. Oh, actually, the connector wasn't working and I didn't realize. So it said, oh, the connector's not working. We connected. I go, okay, it's reconnected. And then it pulls the meeting data and figures it out. So what's really useful about, AI in general, but, Claude is that it can help figure out problem solve its own problems. And that's another really useful feature of it as well. Now, this is another thing I'm going to talk about quickly. This is called an artifact. So this is all dummy data. It's all made up. But essentially what an artifact is when it pulls from all of your connectors and produces like a live dashboard for you. So this is a connector this is an artifact that's got my email, my Gmail, my Outlook. It's got, well, theoretically Xero, Stripe, pulls in all that information so I can have a quick review of like, what are the things I've got to do? What are what's my schedule? What are my emails, the tasks that I'm doing? What are the things I've got to follow up on? Cash position, blah, blah, blah. So things like that. So you can do it for anything though. So it's useful in terms of, I think, emails and calendar. That's a useful one. It can also build things, for example, if you were doing a, say, dashboard for your clinic on policies and procedures, and anytime you added a policy procedure into a folder, it can talk to that folder and just update itself, and you can access this on the internet. So that's a really useful way of that. So there's a ton of things that you can use artifacts for. This is just Gemini. So um, I use Gemini quite a bit. What I do is I go at Gmail, can you find that email I wrote to this person? Summarize it, or what are the issues? So if you're having trouble finding things in your Gmail, I do find, and this is sort of another tip, sometimes Gemini is pretty good at it because it's more tightly integrated, I suppose, than Claude. But I find Claude does a really great job as well. But you might find that Gemini is useful in that regard. Now I try to keep everything pretty much on. That's the end of that slide. Let me go back to the other one and we'll do some more questions. I try and keep everything on the one Claude, because it gets to know you a bit better, and I think that gives you. Let me see if there's any QA. Got a few more questions. It's got more context. So what do you think would be a reasonable cost per token use for the future if they move to cost per token charge? Oh, good question. I can't answer that. As cheap as possible. Is there not a significant risk to connect Claude to zero with all that information there? There is a risk. So there is. You're absolutely right. Do we need to subscribe to Claude to do all this? Yeah, so the paid subscription initially is at $29 a month. So it's relatively cheap. I have the next model up, which is like $150 a month, and then like our developers will use like the Pro Max plan, which is like $300 a month. You just get more tokens and things like that. I find that if you were just using it for co-work and not coding, you would probably find the $29 plan goes very far. So it's not terribly expensive. So let me just go through my main slide. So now I've shown you a few things. I do have the YouTube, which walks through these things a bit further. So prompting is like a really important thing. So the value that you get out of a scribe, not scribe, sorry, the value that you get out of AI is probably related to how well your prompts are. So giving it context, constraints, boundaries, specifying formats, iterating on previous prompts, assigning a role, things like that. So, as a, act as practice manager, develop these policies. Here are previous ones. here's the RSCGB fifth standards in a PDF, so that's context, and then it'll give you like a really great answer. And you know, here's my website. So the more context you give it, the better the answer is. If you just say create these things, it's kind of gonna do it, but it doesn't have context, right? Intermediate levels, when you've got all your connectors, you're putting all that information in. You've got your files, your accounting, so Xero. You can also connect to MYOB, and it's pulling in all that information to create an awesome thing. We talked about this, so I'm gonna go a bit further, a bit quick through this because I know that we're sort of coming up to an hour. And I did want to get through a couple more things. We talked about the triage. We talked about P&L. Let me talk a little bit about BAS statements. So you're right. You know, there is risk of connecting it to your Xero. You know, for me, it's fine. So I'll get my connected to my, you know, personal Xero for my like, you know, personal, you know, MBS Pro, whatever. It'll create BAS statements. I can send those off to the accountant and say, you know, this is what I've got so far. The accountant can quickly flick through those, you know, fix anything that might need to be fixed because they've got access to Xero as well. And then we can do that like really quickly and efficiently. Now, I do want to explain this in a little bit more, in a more of like, you know, how-to fashion. What I'm thinking of doing is two other webinars. So one on Claude Code, which is more of a developer thing, so like building software, and I'll do that with one of our developers. And then the other one on with an accountant and going over more like BAS, you know, BAS statements and how we can help, you know, Claude do that. So I'll talk about it a little bit, but I thought that might be useful because I know that that's something that often gets, you know, trips up clinicians in the context of, it always trips me up, you know, GST and things like that, right? So we'll talk about BAS and reconciliation a bit more, but essentially Claude can do a ton of the legwork. Your accountants can sort of help sign off on it, and so it just really makes it a lot quicker with how it connects. So Gemini. So I was going to talk about Gemini. Gemini works really well with anything that's like native to Google, so Drive, Docs, Sheets, Calendar, because it's all native within Gemini. It connects really well. I think Claude does a great job of connecting to those workspaces, but sometimes you will say, Claude, can you find this email in my Gmail? You know, this particular one, and it can't find it, but the Gemini connector can. Don't know why, don't know if it's related to my prompt, don't know, you know, it's it's just something, but that is sort of like a useful way of using that. Reconcile my week, yeah. So I use it a lot for reconciliation in terms of the you know, credit card, you know, BAS statement type things. I think that's a fantastic way of doing that. So here are some other things that we can do in an advanced statement. So triaging your inbox and then drafting the replies in your voice because you've set it up with those skills. It knows the way that you write things. It can do all that based on the context. Looking at your payments that have come in through Xero, looking if there's anything that's sort of missing, reconciling things like even payments like you know, payments that are coming for your clinical work, say as a GP, and you think that they might be missing something based on, you know, patients that you've seen. What it can do is it can look for trends really easily. So again, I'm saying don't put in I build Mrs. Smith, you know, a care plan. She lives at this address. Don't put in that. But it might be that, you know, I saw this many patients, I build this, these are the item values of the things that I build. Does that make sense? And then Claude will go, well, no, you know, you build, you know, $1,000 worth of items, but there's 20 different items and they're this value that you know were billed, they don't add up together. So something's missing. So it's really good at like trends and things like that. We talked about the meetings, the newsletters that you might do, the action points that you file and give to all your staff that might be in some of those meetings. And it's a really useful way of like pulling all that together, pulling all of that together in like a really useful type. We talked about the clinic newsletter, which is a great thing. Accreditation documentation, we talked about that as well. Again, in terms of context, I'd say give it your old accreditation documentation, and that's why that can really update things. And give it your, say, your website where you might store some of those policies, procedures, you know, privacy, security terms, blah, blah, blah. That is a useful thing. Room allocation. So we talked about this. So essentially we had a spreadsheet, Excel sheet, where we've got our 17 rooms and our, you know, 30 doctors. Some of those doctors are like week on, week off. Some of them are sort of monthly, whatever. So we're going to put all of those like rules into a spreadsheet. So this is a great way that you can prompt in natural language, say, hey, I need to create a spreadsheet. These are the doctors that I have. They all need to fit. These doctors work this day and, you know, this day and whatever, and we close early that day and fit it all in. So that's like a really, really useful feature you know, really useful feature. Now, contracts. I use it a lot for contracts, all sorts of contracts. So there's a couple of different things that I do with it. So one, review contracts. So whenever I get a contract, I always put it through Claude first. And I say, what is the issue with this contract? Are there any things I need to look out for? Are there any things that don't make sense? And it's fantastic at reviewing it. So either I create a contract and then get Claude to review it, or the lawyers have drafted their base contract, I get Claude to review it, and it can pick up all sorts of things, which is really, really useful in the context of just finding those little things that are, easy to miss. They're not like, someone's trying to, you know, pull the wool over your eyes or something like that. But for example, I'm creating a contract for a doctor and I have these like payment clauses, and two of the clauses that have payments in it didn't make sense. They were like the opposite of each other. So I was going to give this doctor a contract that said, I'm going to pay you this amount. And then in the next schedule, it said, well, actually, I'm going to pay you this amount. And I'd completely missed it, right? So Claude just said, well, hang on, you've got two different payment things here. It doesn't really make sense. So I said, oh, okay. So, and I wasn't really sure how to reconcile because I didn't know which payment was actually the correct method. So my accountants gave me advice and said, because they looked at the contract, they were the ones that were building it, and said, oh, actually, no, yeah, it's meant to be this. And there's a few other mistakes that we'd spotted before. So now I've got this email from the accountants and my contract. So how do I put them together? Well, I just copy and paste the email from the accountants, which says, these are the issues with it, put it into Claude and say, can you fix the contract based on these things? And it makes all the required changes, make sure it is internally sound. And then all of a sudden you've got like a useful contract. Other thing that's useful is like plain English review. Like I am not a lawyer. Some of these terms and conditions do not make any sense to me. That might be like a lease agreement. You're renting out a room, might be a new contract, might be, you're buying a car and you got a contract for that. And it's really useful to say, look, this is the plain English of this, and this is what makes sense, and this is what doesn't make sense. Sort of advanced levels, you might give it some contract law examples, some IP law examples, etc., from your state or something like that. If you have some PDFs, and then it can do like a really in-depth review and say, well, based on that, these are the things that sort of make sense or whatever. This is an AI assisted operating rhythm. So, for example, you might have a daily like brief. What are the meetings you're going to? Who are you meeting with? What is their background? What are the things you're chatting about? These are the things in your inbox. These are the high value tasks that you could be doing today, right? Like we've all got 10 million tasks. These are high value tasks. You've got your weekly review in terms of your clinical meetings. You do a recording, get your action points, email it to the appropriate people, follow up with an email that Claude can do, and then get that information coming back into your emails, where then Claude can all put it together for you, and you can read the outcomes of that stuff. P&L reviews, if higher risk stuff, but P&L reviews, accreditation check, roster planning is certainly useful as well. So we talked about not putting in clinical data, not putting in patient identifiable data and things like that. So this is non-clinical stuff, right? Non-clinical, just to be aware of that. So oh yeah, okay, I got a couple more slides. So these are the things that you can do to have a bit of a playground. I would get started with Claude Cowork. I think that's a really, really useful tool. There's a ton of stuff that can do, especially with all the context that you give it. So we'll go through some questions. Things that I've sort of like earmarked if anyone's interested is like that BAS session. So I've got an accountant that's going to do a session with me, and we can talk about how to sort of do it in Claude. Essentially, Zero is a connector into Claude, and you can say, look at my Zero. Can you do a BAS statement for me? And I'm going to do it with the accountant, so it sort of hopefully makes a bit more sense because I'm not an accountant. And then the other session, which is probably more of a development session, if anyone's interested in that. So that's Claude Code. So Claude Code is the development side of Claude Cowork. So Cowork is, can you create a document or a spreadsheet? Claude Code is you're doing things like Python scripts and JSON and all these words. Like, who is JSON? I don't even know. So all of these weird like developer type things. For that, I would get one of my developers because I am not a developer. So hopefully that would be a useful session. If any of those pique your interest, put it in the chat and we can go through those things. So how do you connect your Zero to Claude? Zero asks for authentication. So the same way that you would log into Zero, where it asks you for two-factor authentication, is the same way that you do it with Claude. So I think I do have an example of that on my YouTube to go through it. So you connect the Claude, it'll open up in a browser like Zero. You log in with your normal details and enable the connection, and then it'll open Claude back up and it's connected. How can you use Claude for CPD? Oh, yes. So I have a video on that. So how can you use Claude for CPD? I completely forgot. So thank you for reminding me of that. So you can connect your email. So Gmail, Calendar, Outlook again. It's got all that context. And then you can open up RSCGP. So I can sort of show you live almost if you want to. So RSGP login, right? And then you can get Claude for Chrome, and then you can get it and say, can you fill out my CPD based on my Gmail and Outlook? And what it'll do, so log into your RSGP here, go, my account CPD, and then you can get Claude to fill it out. So I have a YouTube video on that exactly, and that is a really useful task. I completely forgot about that one. That is super useful. So thank you for reminding me of that one. So that's awesome. How do you use Claude find discrepancy between item numbers billed and the money that actually came into your account? So that's a reconciliation thing. So essentially what you can do is so again, just being mindful that you're not putting in, clinical data. You might put in your billing transactions. You should be able to get a receipt from that from, just straight from BP, as in these are all the patients you've seen. Don't put that in, and these are the associated billings. Which is like, I've got 20 billings. I did 10 23s and 3 care plans. Like just that information, not I did Mrs. Smith's care plan for diabetes. And then you got that information, and then you might have either some sort of reconciliation from like your practice, or you might have a specific doctor account, so like your account under your ABN, where all that money goes into, after you've been paid, and then you say, okay, this is how much I got paid, and this is what the best practice or MD or whoever you're using, this is what they say in terms of getting paid. Does this make sense? Even better if you've got the actual specific amount. So if you're getting paid, $5,000 from your practice, and that's made up of obviously lots of little different things, that's a little bit harder to reconcile. Hopefully, you'll be able to get the transactions from your clinic. If not, that is a bit tricky. But if you can get the transactions from your clinic, so anything that's been receipted in BP or MD or whatever, and then the actual money per item, then you should be able to reconcile that and say, have I been paid? One, the correct amount, and two, the correct percentages. So that's sort of a common thing that can come up. Any other questions? Oh, what are your instructions for Claude? So I'd say that I'm still pretty basic at this. So super happy if anyone's got suggestions and things that I can do better about using AI. Super happy for that. I find that my instructions are or my prompts are relatively basic in terms of what I get to do. But what I try and do is give it a lot of context. And I will give it multi-step instructions. So I do try and be clear around that. So can you do the following? Step one, look at my email, Gmails, grab this context from these files, blah, blah, blah. Step two, email these people. Step three, do that, etc. I find that's a useful way. But prompt engineering is a skill in and of itself. The ability to get the most out of your AI is certainly, useful. How would you use it as a simple contractor, not an owner or PM? So CPD, I'd use it for CPD. I'd use it for my email triage and looking at my calendars and setting up what things are happening. I would also get it to do. What else would I get it to do? They're the things that I would use it. Reconciliation. So BAS and reconciliation. So they're probably the four main things that I do. So reviewing your contract when you start as a contractor, BAS, reconciliation, reviewing your inbox triage. Yeah, they're the main things. I mean, in settings. So sorry, what was that question? What is your instructions for Claude? Oh, in settings. Okay. Good question. I have to look at what my instructions are. I don't know. I haven't looked at that one in a while. I'm not 100% sure. Can we have a session about the item numbers build or the actual income, or maybe a YouTube video on how to do it? Yeah, that's yeah, I could do something like that and sort of how to do that reconciliation. I think I do have a video on that on YouTube that actually does the reconciliation. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I do. So if you go to the YouTube channel, has some reconciliation on there. Any other questions? I'll check in the Q&A. I'm just mindful that I've kept you for an hour. I really appreciate everyone signing up and everyone coming. Hopefully it's been helpful in terms of, you got some ideas about, cool things that you can do with Claude and ChatGPT and similar, things like that. But otherwise, what I'll do is I'll stop sharing. Happy to answer any other questions. Like, really appreciate you coming. Hopefully that gets you started on what Claude can do from a non-clinical point of view. And then it's something that we can, you can build out and use more and more, because AI is definitely not going away. It's going to be, more and more used, and hopefully more helpful. Cool, awesome. Excellent. Perfect. Okay. All right, we'll stop the recording there. Really appreciate you coming. Hopefully that was helpful. This is recorded. It'll go up on YouTube, so you can have a look there, but I've got other videos as well. Thanks, but confused. That's okay. That's okay. Me too. All right. Awesome. Awesome. All right. I'll leave you to it. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.